Night. The Urals. Winter 1942. Snow hangs on the conifers like ash. Sirens in the distance. The war far away, and yet everywhere. A lantern bobs in the mouth of a mine, an iron ore gallery cut into the rock years before the war, where men in quilted jackets ease a milling machine down a sloping drift with block and tackle. The machine is oiled, wrapped, and tied like a wounded animal. Its crate kisses the rail ties. Steam lamps hiss. Someone mutters, "Careful, this spindle is worth more than a train car." A foreman nods toward the dark. "Roll it inside." Two soldiers at the entrance pull a tarp over the opening. The wind takes the last glow. The valley falls quiet. This is the scene that many workers would later recall when they said the Soviet Union did something peculiar that winter. It moved a piece of its tank industry underground. Our story follows the man who made it possible. Isaak Moisevich Salzman was not a general by training, yet he wore shoulder boards. He was not a designer by trade, yet tanks rolled because of his demands. Born in 1905 in a small town in what is now Ukraine, the son of a tailor who died after the Civil War's pogroms, Salzman trained as an engineer and rose quickly in the heavy industry of Leningrad. By 1938, he was directing the Kirov plant, that sprawling complex at the western edge of the city, where steel, boilers, tractors, and eventually heavy tanks flowed in a nightly river of sparks. In June 1941, Germany invaded. Within weeks, frontline factories became targets. In Leningrad, the Kirov plant survived the tightening noose of the siege by fragmenting and by moving what it could east. Evacuation became a verb with its own grammar: load, lash, label, dispatch. Whole workshops went on flat cars. A turbine was a convoy. An assembly line became a timetable. When the decision was made to pull the Kirov plant's tank capability out of range, the destination was Chelyabinsk in the Urals. There, on the foundations of a tractor plant under expansion, the Soviets raised Tankograd, a complex that would pour out heavy vehicles, engines, and self-propelled guns at a pace that defied imagination. Salzman helped lead that exodus and, more importantly, teach a factory to speak a new language in weeks. He was the sort of manager who camped on the shop floor, whose coat was oil-stained by morning, who knew which foreman could ream a bore blindfolded, and which bureaucrat needed a phone call from Moscow to stop asking for signatures. He believed in simple things: eliminate idle motion, bring parts to workers, discipline the pace, and above all, shield the line from disruption. That last principle shaped his next assignment. In February 1942, Salzman arrived in Nizhny Tagil, an industrial town bracketed by blast furnaces and iron ore pits. Here, the Ural carriage works, Uralvagonzavod, had stamped out freight wagons before the war. Now it had a new heart. The Kharkiv tank factory, evacuated in pieces, had been merged into the Tagil complex to form Ural Tank Plant No. 183. The design bureau that had birthed the T-34 was here. So were metallurgists from Mariupol, foundrymen from Bijitsa, and toolmakers from Moscow. On paper, it was a behemoth. In reality, it was a tangle of communities, crates, machines that didn't fit their foundations, and unheated shells that pretended to be workshops. Salzman walked through it all with a notebook and a clock. He saw where the frames rattled on their skids at the turning station. He noticed how the foundry sand froze in the rail skip because the cover didn't fit. He listened to the chain noise at the final assembly hall and heard something else, the long reach of Luftwaffe maps. Tagil was east but not invisible. The Soviet Union had learned by 1942 that the only way to keep production stable under bombing was to disperse, hide, and double. If one workshop fell silent, another must hum louder. In Tagil, that meant two strategies. First, camouflage and fragmentation on the surface. Decoy roofs, netting, false elevations, and small satellite shops sprinkled among rail sidings and timber lots. Second, and this is where the valley's geology mattered, using the region's mine galleries as ready-made shelters for precision work that could not tolerate a single night of darkness. This decision did not turn the mines into a full, underground tank factory. Hulls and turrets, those iron megafauna, were born in the foundries and rolled through above-ground lines. But certain functions, the ones most vulnerable to interruption, could live underground. Tool rooms, gauge laboratories, repair bays for gearboxes and engine components, stores of fixtures and jigs, even a line for subassemblies where men with calipers and patience worked under rock and lamps. Some veterans remembered the mine air as clean and cool, always the same temperature, with a hint of rust. They recalled chalk marks on the wall that were not maps of ore bodies, but talked times, tiny calendars in minutes. A fitter named Borodin used to say, "We are not in a mine, we are in a clock." Others remembered the problems: dripping ceilings that ruined paper packing, ventilation that had to be coaxed into the blind headings with old mine fans, floors that needed sleepers and planks before a lathe could be leveled. The mine was a refuge and a challenge. Historians debate the scope of this underground chapter. Some archival papers speak clearly about dispersal and the use of shelters and adits for critical tooling in the Tagil district. Others, including memoirs and local histories, describe whole galleries converted into workshops during bombing alerts. What is uncontested is the intent: to ensure that a broken window or a night raid never stopped the pace of the T-34. Under Salzman's command, Plant Number 183 found its rhythm. By late spring 1942, the line produced dozens of tanks per day, pushing toward a cadence that masters later described simply, every half hour, one hull rolled. To do this at the edge of winter, with one eye on the horizon and another on the fit between a turret race and its bearings, required a new psychology: simplify, standardize, and pre-stage everything. Drive shafts arrived at assembly, fitted with their keys. Wiring looms came on wooden frames cut to the length of a tank hole, so an electrician could lay them without measuring. The painting booth borrowed ideas from wagon work. Frames hung like goods on a rail going past the sprayers. Documentation shrank. A card on a hook, a number chalked on steel, meant more than a form in triplicate. When there weren't enough crane hooks, a forge hammered out more at night. Workers created their own folklore. A movement called the Thousanders began when a milling machinist named Dmitry Bozy, impatient with quotas, decided he would cut 1,000 parts himself in a shift if the supply crew kept him fed with blanks and the tool crib stopped hoarding cutters. Supervisors did not object. They adapted. The morale of a place can be measured in how often people say, "we." In Tagil, we built a tank together. Women setting turret bearings, teenagers carrying springs, veterans showing 20-year-olds how to feel when a thread binds. The T-34 that rolled out of Tagil was the war's workhorse on the Eastern Front. Its 76.2mm gun, later an 85mm, was only part of its power. The rest was in its manufacturability. Wide tracks for mud and snow, sloped armor that shed shells like rain, a diesel engine that tolerated dirt and poor fuel, a hull that, though rough in places, could be stamped, welded, and mated fast. The plant's designers, led by engineers from Kharkiv, made the T-34 more production-friendly with each quarter. Fewer parts in the turret ring, standardized periscopes, simplified engine mounts, weld seams moved to where jigs could grip them. These were quiet revolutions, as important to victory as any reinforced glacis. Salzman's phone calls connected Tagil to every necessary ally. He leaned on the Mariupol Steel Group, now camped in the Urals, to hit the chemistry for armor plate. He requisitioned machine tools from a stalled factory 2 oblasts away. He asked the local mine administration for timber, rails, and the old miners who knew how to shore a gallery in a day. The miners responded with trains of pit props, surplus track, and a habit of moving heavy things in tight spaces. "You don't need a crane down there," a mine captain told an assembly foreman. "You need law, a pulley, patience, and a place to stand." The war fed on numbers, and Tagil fed the war. In the second half of 1942 and throughout 1943, the plant's output grew until it surpassed, by itself, the combined output of Germany's manufacturers of medium tanks. That claim, often repeated, is rooted in production ledgers. Hundreds of hulls per month, tens of thousands by the war's end across the Tagil and Chelyabinsk complexes. On some days, in June and July 1943, when the Kursk salient bristled, the plant shipped more machines than the accounting office could stamp before midnight. The line foreman would write the final serial numbers with a stump of chalk on a plank as the train couplings clanged. Meanwhile, the underground spaces continued to play their specific role. When air alerts sounded, the walk to the galleries became part of the shift change. A file of workers, each carrying a crate, the gauge sets, the micrometers, the special boring head, the wooden blocks milled to test an engine mount. Lighting was improved. Fixed lines of bulbs, then better reflectors. The ventilation was reworked with splitters scabbed together from duct tin. Over time, the underground bays evolved from emergency shelters into predictable places. The second shift knew that certain engines would always be honed down there. The jig repair crew had a bench cut to their own hip height right beneath a number painted on the rock. Not everything went smoothly. Moisture condensed on cold metal. Tools rusted if they were left unwrapped. The path to the galleries iced over, and men slipped. Overhead, in the above-ground halls, winter could be a second enemy. Drafts turned paint skins brittle. Drivers waiting for acceptance trials wrapped their hands in rags to turn wheels. But time and motion, when disciplined, have a way of imposing warmth. The plant improvised heaters, built stoves from rejected plate, and routed steam ducts where they do the most good. War teaches triage. So does a queue of hulls that must leave tomorrow. The human stories anchor the statistics. A senior welder recounted standing inside a hull with her daughter, 11 years old, passing welding rods through a slot. A metallurgist remembered sleeping under a bench because the 3 a.m. heat of the open hearth furnace was the only real blanket. A logistics clerk told of learning locomotive schedules the way other people learn poetry, by rhythm and rhyme. If we get axle steel by the 10th, the final drive will be ready by the 19th, unless the bearing cases stumble on the 14th. And a miner, brought in to advise on shoring, joked that the tank plant turned every rock cutter into a machinist because the ore stops for no one, but a lathe demands manners. Salzman's style made enemies as well as miracles. He could be severe. He used the telephone like a bayonet. He demanded figures at noon and improved figures at dusk. A famous story, likely true in essence, embellished in detail, has him standing at a railcar loaded with stamped armor plate, measuring a notch with a ruler, calling a director 3 time zones away, and saying, "Your numbers lie. Send a correct train." People who worked for him spoke of a man with 2 speeds, silence and orders. Yet they also remembered someone who knew the smell of burnt insulation and the sound of a misaligned jig as if they were signatures. In July 1942, after months of such work, he was called to Moscow and appointed People's Commissar of Tank Industry. For a year, through the build-up to Stalingrad and the summer that ended in Kursk, he sat at the apex of the production network, balancing iron and ideas, sending decisions back to the Urals, the Volga, the Siberian plants. Then, in June 1943, he returned to plant management, again tied to the Kirov complex at Chelyabinsk, where heavy tanks and self-propelled guns demanded the same discipline he had drilled into Tagil. His later career would rise and fall with the currents of post-war politics, but his wartime work remained, carved into rails, foundations, and the hands of those who measured with their eyes. The mines receded from memory as quickly as peace returned. As factories added new halls and new roofs, the need for underground bays faded. The adits went dark. Some were sealed. Others became storage. A few became legends. Children told that there had once been a hidden plant in the mountain where men built tanks in secret. The truth, as so often, was less grand and more admirable. Not a subterranean city of armor, but a pragmatic use of stone corridors to protect what the war could not afford to lose: accuracy, continuity, and the fragile chain of parts that make a machine whole. Let us pause and consider what underground meant to those who walked into the rock each shift. It meant a guarantee. The gauge block would be on the bench today, tomorrow, and the day after, no matter what whistles blew. It meant the difference between a gearbox that would seize in the 3rd kilometer and one that would carry a crew to the edge of a village at dawn. It meant that a lathe would not be idle because a roof pane shattered. It meant that the war's randomness was kept outside, while inside, under lamp and rock, the human intention to continue remained unbroken. The Eastern Front devoured machines and men. For every tank seen on a battlefield map, dozens of quiet choices in factories determined whether it would exist and whether it would arrive with a straight turret ring, a clean fuel line, and a transmission that did not howl itself to pieces. In that sense, the mine galleries and the workshops of Tagil were as much a part of the front as the snow-covered fields near Urals or the wheat outside Kharkiv. The men and women who stood at benches and crawled into hulls joined the line of battle in their own way. There is a moment in the memory of a Tagil worker that captures the tone of those years. A shipment was due before nightfall. 25 machines, side by side, on 2 tracks. The last tank would not start. A young electrician, 20 if a day, traced the fault to a bad ground in the engine bay, the sort of invisible problem that can eat hours. He crawled in with a hand lamp, a wrench, and a strip of sandpaper. Above him, a foreman, counting roof rivets by habit, muttered that the lamp would break. It did not. The boy cleaned the contact, tightened the bolt, and the diesel coughed alive like a wakeful bear. As the tank rolled, the boy remained inside, grinning in the red light of the gauge cluster. He rode it out to the yard, the worker said, like a sailor delivering a ship to the sea. The war ended. The numbers settled into ledgers. In the post-war reshuffle, Salzman faced censure and demotion amid the political storms of the late 1940s. He would work again, be restored to the party, and retire decades later in Leningrad. He died in 1988. Across the Urals and into Siberia, streets, plaques, and small monuments recall him, sometimes formally, sometimes as part of a plant's lore. He once stood here, on this floor, and told us to move the bench 2 meters to the left, and he was right. What remains of the mines as workshops today is uneven. In some places, there are records in local archives, orders to prepare adits, requisitions for timber and rails, lists of machines transferred to shelter. In others, there are only testimonies and photographs in private albums, a group of fitters squinting in a lamplit cavern, a crate stenciled with a Tagil inventory number sitting against rock, chalked words on a pillar that read like a prayer, "No stoppage." Historians approach such evidence with care. The claim that there was a single, continuous underground tank factory is too neat. The reality, a network of protected bays for vital work, is both more complex and more believable. And perhaps more moving, because what matters is not the myth, but the method. How a nation under attack kept its machines learning to breathe. Return, then, to the opening image. The milling machine is inside, leveled on timber, its motor humming. A man in a cap checks a dial as the needle leans into a narrow arc. Another adjusts a lamp until the cutter's edge gleams. They are not heroes in the cinematic sense. They are not even names in most books. Yet the tanks that rolled out the factory gates and onto flat cars, the tanks that crested ridges, that guarded infantry in the snow, that arrived at the front on time, those machines owed their lives to moments like this, to a prepared adit, to a foreman who counted minutes, to an engineer who would not accept a stoppage. In the end, the underground was not a place. It was a promise that the line would hold, even when the sky did not.